Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. On October 26, 1979, Park Chung-hee, President of the Republic of South Korea, was assassinated by KCIA Chief Kim Jae-gyu. The death of Park Chung-hee marked the beginning of a long and painful process of democratization for South Korea, which culminated in 1992 with the election of a civilian as president, Kim Young-sam. Park's presidency is still the subject of heated debate in South Korea to this day. For some, he was the providential man who supervised the country's economic development and asserted its independence and identity on the international stage, resisting pressure from both its enemies, mainly North Korea, and its allies. For others, he was an unscrupulous dictator, not hesitating to use all the means of coercion at his disposal to stay in power. This extreme polarization of Korean society around Park means that cinema has rarely dealt with the man directly. But his assassination still spawned two feature films, The President's Last Bang and The Man Standing Next. Two works that choose very different angles to approach this major event in the modern history of South Korea. In this video, we will see in detail these two approaches. On May 16, 1961, a military coup ended the civilian government of South Korea. At its head, an ambitious and politically savvy Major General, Park Chung-hee. Inspired by the Japanese model, both the Meiji Restoration and the post-war economic miracle, he implemented a number of reforms aimed at modernizing and industrializing the economy with the central idea of enriching the country in order to strengthen the army. Relying on the chaebols, large industrial conglomerates equivalent to the Japanese zaibatsu, South Korea managed to experience a real economic miracle, quickly distancing its northern neighbor. But the miracle took place in pain, the majority of the population having to bear the reforms in sweat and blood. Working conditions in industry were worthy of the Victorian era, slums around the cities flourished, and all opposition was violently repressed, whether through direct military intervention or via the most insidious secret police, the KCIA. Park skillfully weaved between temporary democratic overtures and authoritarian methods to consolidate his power and establish himself as a de facto president for life. A few films managed to confront the regime's draconian censorship heads-on to describe its less glorious aspects, such as Ha Gil-jong's March of Fools, which shows a youth having great difficulty in flourishing in this repressive climate, or Bae Chang-so's People from the Slum, describing the difficult living conditions of workers from the countryside coming to cities. But most of the films produced during the period were obviously favorable to the regime, such as Wives on Parade by Im Kwon-taek, which praised government reforms in the countryside. And it wasn't until censorship began to relax in the late 1980s that film critical of Park Chung-hee's leadership began to flourish. Such as Seoul Rainbow by Kim Oh-sun, denouncing the sexual exploitation of starlets by the political elite. But if South Korean cinema began a real critical introspection on the years of powers of Park Chung-hee from the end of the 1980s, it was not until the beginning of the 2000s that it confronted his figure a little more frontally. The first to attempt it was The President's Barber by Im Chang-song. In this 2004 film, Song Kang-ho puts on his usual costume of Mr. Everybody, a hairdresser officiating next to the Blue House, and who finds himself becoming Park Chung-hee's official barber. The portrait that is made of the dictator and of the period perfectly illustrates the ambivalence of Korean society towards him.
어떻게 하셨어요?
On the one hand, there is a relative nostalgia, supported by an abundant use of comedy, and a description of a tough man animated by a vision for the country. On the other, we have a critique of the power struggles around the dictator, and the denunciation of the regime's abuses and its multiple violations of human rights. The circumstances of Park Chung-hee's assassination are known. The regime was then in a state of siege under the combined pressure of Jimmy Carter's moral politic and anti-government demonstration in the south of the country. On the evening of October 26th, during a dinner, Park discussed these problems with Kim Jae-gyu, the boss of the KCIA, and Cha Ji-chol, the head of the Presidential Security Service. Cha promoted a policy of harsh repression, where Kim pushed for a more conciliatory approach, a stance that earned him criticism from both the president and his close associate. Kim Jae-gyu, after going away for a short while, came back into the room and shot the two men. These events are faithfully reproduced in The President's Last Bang that Im Sang-soo directed in 2005. The film is a real denunciation of the regime and the personality of Park Chung-hee. His economic successes are absent, and Im focuses instead on the hyper-repressive climate of the regime, the abuses of the secret services, the quarrel of services and men, or even on the sexuality of the leader. Everyone is at fault in The President's Last Bang. The famous dinner logically occupies most of the footage and is carefully reconstructed. Park's current concerns, his hatred of Carter or his desire to acquire the atomic bomb, are well illustrated. And of course, the opposition between the two close associates of the president and how to handle the protests. However, this last point and the resulting personal opposition between Kim and Cha is not that present in the film, which makes the gesture of the KCIA boss all the more surprising. But just like The President's Barber before it, The President's Last Bang can't help but incorporate a large dose of comedy through bumbling agents or incongruous situations. The inclusion of these little comedic moments sadly detracts from the impact of the political drama playing out before our eyes. The motives behind Kim Jae-gyu's gesture are still the subject of many conjectures today. Did he act as a patriot with the interests of the country in mind? Was his action motivated by the desire to establish a true democracy, for personal gains, or just out of anger? Im Sang-soo's film is rather vague on the matter. 15 years later, it is specifically the assassin that director Woo Min-ho chose to follow in his The Man Standing Next. Based on a book by Kim Chung-sik, published in the early 1990s, The Man Standing Next focuses on the person of Kim Jae-gyu, but also on his predecessor as the head of the KCIA, Kim Yong-woo. The film thus opened with the latter's testimony before the American Commission of Koreagate, a scandal linked to the illegal lobbying of parliamentarians by the South Korean government. Much of the plot revolves around the eventual publication of his memoirs and the direct indictment of Park Chung-hee's regime-related abuses that would ensue. The real Kim actually disappeared in 1979 in Paris and, depending on the versions, was either brought back to Seoul to be shot by Park or eliminated by French gangsters at the request of South Korea. A 2005 commission concluded that he had indeed been shot on the orders of Kim Jae-gyu. Would this act have motivated the subsequent assassination of the dictator as the film implies? This remains open to discussion. The Man Standing Next is also quite adept at establishing the various potential motivations behind the gesture of the KCIA boss without choosing a single justification. The rivalry between the head of the service secret and the boss of the Presidential Security Service is thus well highlighted, more so than in the 2005 film. Park himself is described as a cunning politician, prompt to burst of anger behind his calm facade. His authentic talent for playing divide and conquer is skillfully put forward. The old-school political thriller treatment of the film also makes The Man Standing Next a more satisfying spectacle for the viewer. But by their different ways of approaching this major historical event for South Korea, the President's Last Bang and The Man Standing Next complement each other rather harmoniously and, put together, enable us to have a good idea of the circumstances related to the assassination of the dictator. Although many films before The President's Last Bang had already criticized Park Chung-hee's regime, the frontal attack on his person by Im Sang-soo was the subject of controversy. The former dictator's son demanded that the release of the film be banned. The court refused to ban the film but ordered the producers to cut 4 minutes of archive footage. Frightened by the controversy, the distributor chose to withdraw, and the film was finally released in a relatively small number of theaters, a fact which certainly contributed to the disappointing result at the box office. Ultimately, the originally censored footage was allowed to be reinstated, provided it had an introductory panel explaining that the film was a work of fiction. But the damage had been done, and the subject was considered for several years by the producers as too sensitive to deserve the investment of millions of won. This explains why it took almost 15 years to see another work dealing with the person of the former dictator. But conversely, it is interesting to note that The Man Standing Next was hardly the object of attacks and was even a success at the Korean box office. The presence of a star like Lee Byung-hun certainly contributed to this good result, but we can also think that the passage of time has done its job and that the presidency of Park Chung-hee can be viewed in a less passionate way. The fall of his daughter, Park Gun-hee, in 2017 may also have played a role in the reduced pro-Park activism in recent years. While the death of Park Chung-hee was a first step in the direction of establishing true democracy in South Korea, the road to its achievement was still strewn with pitfalls. On November 3, 1979, Park Chung-hee was buried under the gaze of a weeping crowd. Chun Do-wan, a military officer close to Park, was appointed head of the Assassination Investigation Committee and took advantage of it to grab as much power as possible, becoming the de facto new dictator at the head of South Korea. The following year, another event took place, as traumatic as it was fundamental for the movement, the Gwangju Massacre. This is what we will see in the next video.